Hello and welcome to finally another episode of Armored Warfare with your host Star Peppers. Still in the process of moving over here. I really wish I could do some more videos right now because there are actually quite a few interesting things happening in Armored Warfare at the moment, but just gonna have to wait till the move is done. But the other day I was reading about the British Chieftain tanks the other day, and I wanted to make a video about this rather interesting evolution of the British tank line. I haven't been playing much Armored Warfare as of late. Usually I just log into Grand Theft Auto or something else mindless to numb my brain for a little while in between packing stuff. I've been recording some stuff from those sessions, but I haven't really figured out a way to fit it into this channel's theme yet. It's not to say I have been idle when it comes to ideas for videos. I've been coming up with quite a few, and once I move and get my new computer put together, I'll be in a much better position to create them. I always want to try and maintain that connection to the real world subject that a particular game is based on, even if that might be a little of a stretch at times. But enough about that, let's move on to the Chieftain. Conception. Like most tanks in this game, the Chieftain was the result of a need for effective tanks to deal with the new tanks being fielded by Warsaw Pact countries in the early 1960s. At the time of its debut in the British military, the main threats from the Soviet Union were the T-62 with the 115mm gun and the T-64 with the 125mm gun, both smoothbore with fin-stabilized ammunition. They remained the Chieftain's primary competition until 1973 with the release of the T-72. The Chieftain was essentially a further evolution on the British cruiser line of tanks that sort of dates back to before the Second World War. It was a culmination of all lessons learnt during the war, during which many British tanks suffered from insufficient protection from German armour. Although it is worthwhile to point out that the gap between German and Allied tanks may not have been as large as most people think. Yes, the Tiger was superior to many Allied tanks, but there weren't very many of them operating in France during the Normandy campaign. In fact, many reported Tigers were probably just misidentified Panzer IVs with the added spaced armor that sort of makes it look like a Tiger at first glance. I've always wondered if the Germans did that intentionally to make the Allies think they had more Tigers than they actually had. But we're getting a bit off topic. Even though the Chieftain was made to fulfill the role of a cruiser tank, it differed from past cruiser tanks in that it made armor and firepower a higher priority than speed and mobility, a key characteristic of past cruiser tanks, although they still wanted to maintain the same kind of speed as a traditional medium tank. As for armor, at the time of its release it was the most heavily armored tank in the world, mainly due to the use of a lot of angling armor. The effective thickness of the upper glacis was 388mm because of the angle from an actual thickness of 120. This heavily sloped, low-profile hull was made possible by having the driver's seat reclined heavily while buttoned up. When you first see the armor stats for the Chief, you may get a bit disappointed, but know that the angling of the armor will vastly improve its effectiveness, and it was designed with that in mind. That said, it does have a few glaring weak spots that you have to constantly be aware of. As I said, the upper glacis has an extremely good angle, but the lower glacis is a weak spot, similar to most other tanks. So try and keep that covered up whenever possible. The side armor is average when compared to other main battle tanks of the tier. It will be able to bounce shots at extreme angles, even decent angles, but I find as long as I have my lower glacis covered, I prefer to engage my enemy facing directly at them, because a turret is shaped in such a way that it presents your foe with a lack of flat surfaces to target, as long as your lower glacis is covered, as I've said 1,000 times. The program that eventually led to the creation of the Chubham armor began in the early 1960s to improve the Chieftain's existing cast turret, which already gave the crew significant protection as it was. This was presumably in response to the Soviet Combination K armor that first appeared on the T-64, which comprised of a ceramic compound mixed with silicone oxide inserts between layers of rolled steel. The key to composite armor is its ability to resist the extremely hot jet of molten copper that heat ammo uses to penetrate the steel armor. Another example of where you can see ceramics in use is in the brake discs of high-performance cars, where it's also used for its ability to withstand extremely high temperatures. Chubbin armor was even used on the last two variants of the Chieftain 800 and 900, two tanks that I would like to see in armored warfare. The Soviet 125mm smoothbore introduced with the T-64 was probably another contributing factor to wanting to improve the Chieftain's armor. All that said, it would be pretty awesome to see the Chieftain 800 and 900 in the game one day. As for firepower, the Chieftain uses the L11A5 120mm rifled gun, and unlike many other contemporary tank guns, it loaded the charge and the projectile separately, sort of like you would see on a battleship or other naval ships. It also uses wet storage for the ammunition, meaning that if the ammunition was hit, a fluid would flood the powder, making it inert. It was made as a successor to the 105mm L7 gun on the Sigerian. Most common ammunition types were the high explosive squash head and the AP discarding sabot, although others were used. Personally in game, I find only having squash and AP a bit disappointing, a bit limiting, but I don't think they used heat. Because there are many vehicles that squash ammo is incapable of dealing large damage to, because many employ countermeasures for squash ammo. This takes the form of a layer of Kevlar lining the inside of the tank, or APC, so the metal shards dislodged by the plastic explosive in a squash shell won't harm the crew. The AP discarding sabot has good penetration, but the lesser damage can make taking out light vehicles with squash countermeasures rather time consuming. When it comes to speed, the Chieftain is pretty average, although I suppose for its size it isn't entirely unimpressive. However, with all this impressiveness came a British Leyland L60 engine. It was designed to run on whatever fuel happened to be available at the time, but was known to have a vast array of mechanical issues. The engine did not deliver the power that it was expected, and early on it was estimated to have a 90% breakdown rate. But this was after all the same company that made the Morris Marina. I'm just picturing a helicopter dropping a piano on a Chieftain now. Not that it would do anything to it. In the world. And there were a number of countries that operated Chieftain tanks, like Iran and Jordan. The Iranian Chieftains were obtained before the 1979 Islamic Revolution, when it was still under the control of the West-friendly Shah. They were used by Iran, and this was really the only time the Chieftain was actually used in combat. They were used by Iran in the Iran-Iraq War, where it went up against the Iraqi T-62, and to a lesser extent the T-72. But due to their unreliability and inability to attain new parts for their now unfriendly suppliers, they were eventually phased out. Armored forces were severely mismanaged by both sides in the war, so there aren't really any conclusions concerning to how the Chieftain would have operated against its Soviet counterparts. But later in the Chieftain's life, its age did begin to show, with guns like the Soviet 2A46 125mm smoothbore that was made specifically to deal with tanks like the Chieftain. And around that time, many countries began to phase out the Chieftain. In the end, despite its initially impressive armor, the tank seems to be more well known for its faults instead of its strengths. The tank never really had a chance to prove itself. It only saw action in the Iranian military, who didn't have the necessary logistics to operate and maintain them properly. So even though the British were constantly upgrading and improving design, none of those improvements made their way into the Iranian variants. So that's all for today, and hopefully I'll be able to get something else up soon. But until then, thanks for watching, and until next time, good night. Damn it, condenser microphone. Why do you have to pick up everything? The program that eventually created Chubham Armor, Chubham,